All right, let's see.
22?
Yeah, I believe that's where we are. Best I can recollect, we are on chapter 22.
Yep. Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines for many days was the last thing we read.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. Well, my goal tonight is to get down through verse 14. Are you taking bets on whether I make it?
No comment.
Odds are slim.
I had surgery here, I don't know, it's probably been 4 or 5 years ago now. Most of us in here have been under anesthesia at one point or another for various reasons. You know, I never have quite figured out why, when they're about to knock you out, so often they want you to start counting backwards. And
It's a
I wouldn't.
distraction.
Well, the guy's like, okay, start backwards from 100 now. And I just looked at him, kind of gazed up and was like, come on, count. And I said, what difference does it make? Said, you're going to knock me out in the next 2-3 seconds anyway. Just go, come on, just, you know, humorous, count backwards. And I looked at him and said, you and the nurses have got a bet going as to how far I make it, don't you? And he just started snickering. And I said, yeah, I figured. So I said, all right, I'll humor you. And so I said 100. As soon as I said 99, I could smell the, he said, she hit the gas, and I think I made it to 97. That's the last I remember.
96, 97 is about as far as anybody gets.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, chapter 22.
What did that have to do with anything?
Nothing.
What's that?
That comment had absolutely nothing to do with
That was a
What?
freebie.
Yeah.
That
I wondered if it
was
was a prep for the lesson or something. It was,
no,
it was a complete off the wall.
no, it's on your comment because I asked if you were you taking bets on how far I was going to make it.
It was.
See, there was a segue in there.
Tangentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
You totally missed the segue.
Merrill brought up backpedaling anyway, so.
Exactly. All right. Now it came about after these things, and of course, so often whenever Moses writes this phrase, after these things, clearly chronologically, he's establishing that this came later. What we can't tell, was it just after that, or it could have been years after that. There's no way to tell. All it tells us here is that chronologically, he's given us a clue here that this was sometime later. But as we look through this, considering our last account of Isaac was in about the first part of chapter 21, when Abraham was throwing the party for Isaac being weaned, which we figured he would have been 2, maybe 3 years old tops. And now we see the next description we have of Isaac. He's going with Abraham up to Mount Moriah, and he's at least a teenager at this point. So we've skipped a considerable amount of time here. But it says, came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Now, with regard to testing Abraham, what does the Bible say about God tempting people?
He doesn't do that.
It doesn't.
Does not tempt. But the one thing that which basically, and this is an important consideration because there are some translations that do tend to lean in that direction in their interpretation of this word. Temptation involves trying to get somebody to sin. A test is seeing if somebody does not sin. Generally the exact opposite. God does test us, and he does it frequently, but God does not tempt us. God doesn't try to get us to sin, but He does place circumstances in our way to see if we're not going to sin. And in this case, He tests Abraham not to see if Abraham's going to sin, but it's a test of faith. And He said, "Take now your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah." Now, notice how God describes Isaac.
Only son.
Isaac is not Abraham's only son. So why does God refer to him as this? God knows he's got Ishmael.
He's the only son of the promise.
He's the only promised son. And this confirms for us that it was certainly God's intention that at this point in his life he would be Abraham's only son. Now, God had promised Abraham he would have many other descendants, and he did have a lot of other sons and daughters later on down the line. But the presence of Ishmael in all of this story at this point was not God's will at this point. But there's another reason that God refers to Isaac as his only son. We're going to take this a little bit at a time, but every single point of this story, not just the sacrifice of Isaac. We tend to look at this as, the big picture of Isaac being sacrificed and say, oh, well, that represented or was a type, a precursor, if you will, of the sacrifice of Jesus. But it went way beyond that. Every single point of what we're seeing here points to Jesus, beginning with this. And that's one of the big reasons why God refers to Isaac as his only son. Because what was Jesus?
God's only son.
God's only son. So there's your first point one, the only son. Back to verse 2, it says, "Go to the land of Moriah." Now, at this point, Jerusalem, well, I should say not Jerusalem, but the city of Salem, it had not been renamed Jerusalem yet, it was still called Salem, did exist, but it was a much, much smaller town, and the area that became the Temple Mount was at this point in history not within the city proper of Salem. Now, as Jerusalem grew, it overran what was Mount Moriah, but at this point in history, Salem is a little bit over to the side, maybe a quarter or a half mile away. Mount Moriah is the top of this plateau. If you notice, every time in the Bible when it refers to somebody going to Jerusalem, what geographical term is usually describing it? They go up to Jerusalem. Doesn't matter whether you're going north, south, east, or west. It always says, as Bruce mentioned, they go up to Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem is at the top of this, mountain plateau. And the very top of that was Mount Moriah. The city of Salem, if you could even call it a city at that point, was, as I said, a little bit off, off to the side. Mount Moriah was still pretty much just an uninhabited area near there. But the reason that this is important is because, does anybody know what Mount Moriah became several hundred years later?
Sinai.
Nope. Sinai already existed, but that was probably about 300 miles to the south.
The Temple Mount.
The Temple Mount. This is the Temple Mount. Now, we know that Jesus did not directly get sacrificed in the confines of the temple. He was sacrificed, just outside of town on what the Romans referred to as Golgotha. But where the temple was built, where all the sacrifices would take place, was on the Temple Mount, and Mount Moriah was what the Temple Mount was built on. So there's your second point. He tells Abraham to take Isaac up to what would be the Temple Mount and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Now it's interesting. He says, go to the land of Moriah. Now, of course, we know later on it became known as Mount Moriah, but at this point, just the general area was the land of Moriah. Notice God did not tell Abraham the specific location at this point. Just says, go to the land of Moriah, which was north of where he was. And as he got, close to it, then God pointed out the specific mountain, which became known at that point as Mount Moriah. Verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey. Now, once again, how many times have we seen this? God gives Abraham a direction, and what happens?
He picks up and goes.
First thing the following morning, he gets up and is immediately obedient to what God called him to do. Saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. Now, notice at this point what is remarkably absent. Does anybody notice? What's missing from this story? Mama.
It's not there.
Mama is... Do you think Abraham told Sarah what he was going to do?
Absolutely not.
Oh, no way in the world.
He wouldn't have got out of the tent.
Yeah.
Your
There'd have
dad
been a
goes,
sac-
What to my son?
There would have been a sacrifice right there. Mama would have taken care of business before he ever got out of the tent. So, Mama is absent. Now, to some extent, even that is a mirror of Christ, because we know God, God himself is the Father of Christ, the Holy Spirit. But notice, while Jesus had an earthly mother, once Jesus began his ministry, Mary kind of filtered in and out of the story here and there. But as far as being a central figure in anything, what became of Mary once Jesus began his ministry?
In the background.
She was just kind of off in the background. She had nothing to do with his ministry other than just occasionally being mentioned, following, and even part of that time, she didn't follow his ministry because early in his ministry, Mary and his earthly brothers, they thought he was nuts. Mary did not begin following Jesus until later in his ministry, and even when she did, she was always off kind of in the background. So even here, the absence of Sarah is a mirror of what would happen with Jesus' ministry. Now, not to belittle the Catholics more than they deserve, but notice Catholic theology has reversed that. Catholic theology wants to put Mary at the forefront to the exclusion of Christ. Not biblical. All right. So he takes his 2 young men and Isaac with him, and he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Verse 4, on the 3rd day. Third day. Where have we seen that before? Now clearly this isn't the 3rd day after the sacrifice, but still this concept of 3 days it's there. So you got yet another point where 3 days figures into this. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder, and we will worship and return to you." Now, even that is a mirror of the crucifixion. Because notice what Abraham tells the two servants.
Yes, Dave.
He didn't say, "Stay here with the donkey and I will come back to you." He says,
He said we.
"We." He knows he's going up there to sacrifice his son, but yet he still says, "We will return." How does he know this?
My study notes say that part of what was inherent in his willingness to sacrifice Isaac was the belief that God was going to resurrect Isaac from the dead after he sacrificed him, and that he and Isaac would come down off the mountain together.
And again, that's speculation, but yes, that's the general consensus, and it may have been why he said, "We'll return," because he knows God has told him on several occasions that he was going to have more descendants than he could count.
And he just reminded Abraham that Isaac is his only son.
And just reminded him of that. So there's only, if Isaac is going to be the promised son, which God has told him that, and he's made it very clear, Isaac is your heir. Not some other son that's going to come later, but Isaac will be the heir. He's heard that from God. So the only way around this for Abraham, if Abraham believes that he is to go up here to sacrifice his son, is that somehow God is going to rescue or resuscitate Isaac, that they can return. So what you have here is an inferred reference to the resurrection.
I saw something in a video just a few days ago saying that there's a rabbinic tradition and a belief that Isaac was sacrificed and God did raise him from the dead.
There's some rabbis that want to try to propose that, but that isn't what the Bible tells us.
It's a pretty extreme view among a
Yes.
very small percentage of rabbis.
But usually it's those rabbis that want to say that as a defense against Christianity. Because when Christians then say, well, Isaac is the precursor to Jesus, the rabbis that say Jesus is an imposter, Jesus was not God, Jesus this, Jesus that, they're the ones that come up with that theory that claimed it was all about Isaac. The sacrifice has already been made. Isaac did it. Isaac was resurrected. But again, as you already mentioned, that's not what the Bible tells us. The Bible makes it very clear. God told Abraham, no, don't do it. Although at this point, Abraham doesn't know that. And by the way, Abraham himself is an example of God the Father giving his son. So what we've seen here so far is about at least, I've lost counting, but about half a dozen different references to the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. But he tells his servant, says, we're going to worship and return to you. We will return to you. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. Right there tells us at least our first indication as to how long it may have been. In order to have enough wood to basically consume a sacrifice, you got to have a pretty good fire. This isn't just 3 or 4 pieces of kindling. We're talking, a good bit of wood. So if it's enough wood here to do that, and yet it says he put it on Isaac, probably strapped it to his back or something like that. If Isaac is big enough to carry that much wood, what does that tell us about Isaac's age?
Probably a young teenager.
Grown.
Yeah, he's at least a teenager by this point. Isaac is no little kid.
That's another reference to Christ too.
How so?
Carried the
Because
cross on his back.
Christ had to carry the cross.
Yes, it is. Good point. You got one that I didn't catch. Could have had a V8. Yeah, that's actually, you caught one that I didn't catch, but yes, carried the wood, laid it, then he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. In verse 7, now it starts to get interesting. And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Isaac's obviously old enough at this point. Not only is he able to carry the wood, but Isaac's starting to get suspicious. You got the fire, I got the wood, you got the knife. Where's the sacrifice? Isaac's starting to suspect something. Now, obviously, the fact that he asked this tells us that Abraham has not told Isaac what's up. All Isaac knows is they're going up to make a sacrifice. But Isaac's starting to get suspicious. Which tells me he's at least probably 14, 15 years old by this point. He's not dumb. Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son."
See, there's another reference.
There's another one. Yes, and that's probably the biggest one right there. That God himself will provide the sacrifice. That is the most direct reference to the crucifixion in this whole passage. God will provide. So the two of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. Now, notice at this point, early on, God tells Abraham, just go to the land of Moriah, to the place that I'll tell you about. Now here we say he got to the place of which God had told him. So somewhere in the process, God has, that we're not told about, but God spoke to him again. Because God had to have told him, says, okay, now that you're in that general area, go to this particular location. So there's another communication between Abraham and God that was not relayed here. But now he knows the specific location, which again was later referred to as Mount Moriah. And Abraham built the altar there. Now also, that while it's not directly a reference to the crucifixion, what altar did get built there later?
Temple altar.
The temple. There's your reference to the temple. Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, here's another reference indirectly to Christ. If Isaac is old enough to begin questioning where's the sacrifice, and he's old enough to realize that there's a ram missing here, and he's old enough to carry the wood, Abraham's 100 years old. Which of the two of them do you think is stronger and faster?
Isaac.
Isaac, if he'd have wanted to fight back, could have whipped up his 100-year-old man and took off running, and Abraham would have never caught him.
Yes, but he was bound.
Yeah, but
Before
how?
he got bound, though.
Yeah, he didn't go up there bound.
He
Well,
submitted.
true.
Yeah.
Which this is the thing that so many theologians overlook. We talk about the faith of Abraham, but here's a direct reference again to the crucifixion of Christ.
And
When
the faith of
Isaac, when Isaac finally figured out, I'm the sacrifice, because you figure Abraham had to have at some point, after they got the altar built, Abraham probably said, son, I need you to sit down. I got something I got to tell you.
Pretty incredible.
Isaac, God told me I had to sacrifice you. Well, now, at that point, Isaac could have easily, it's like, no, you're not, popped his dad across the head and took off running. The fact that Abraham was able to tie his hands and somehow bind him up, what does that tell you about Isaac?
He submitted.
Obedience.
He submitted voluntarily. Absolutely. Now, why do you suppose that Abraham, if Isaac was willing to submit, why did Abraham have to tie him up?
I don't think anybody would naturally just lay there as someone's got a knife in the air coming down.
See,
at
that's
you.
the issue. This tells us Abraham was at least trying to be merciful about this. Because if he's going to, stab him in the heart, trying to make this, quick and easy, what happens if Isaac squirms? He's going to miss it, and Isaac's going to die in pain.
I mean, a natural response as someone's doing that would be to flinch.
Oh, yeah, you're going to flinch.
There's no way you're just going to say, "Yo, Dad, okay."
Yeah, so this tells you that Abraham's trying to be merciful about this. He's being obedient, but he's also thinking, I don't want my son to suffer. I want this done quick and over with. So he ties him up so that Isaac can't squirm. But the fact that he was able, a 100-year-old man, able to tie up a teenager, Isaac did so voluntarily. Isaac submitted. Which again, what happened with Jesus?
He submitted.
Not only did he submit, but consider the fact Jesus was not tied to a cross, but what did they do to him?
Nail him.
They nailed him to it. So in a sense, while Isaac was tied up and bound, was Jesus bound?
Yep.
He just different implement, but yeah, Jesus was nailed to the cross.
And both were submitting to the Father.
And both submitted to the Father.
It has to do with obedience.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus was bound when he was led away into captivity to go through everything that led
And
to
that's
the-
another one right there. Coming from the Garden of Gethsemane, they tied him up.
That's what I was saying.
And they led him through all the trials and what have you with him tied up. Which Jesus could easily have just, given the command and those ropes would have just fallen off of him. But he did not. He submitted voluntarily.
Tells you how much faith Isaac had. He had to have something.
Well, this tells you he's been around long enough. Well, this tells me two things. Not only did he trust his dad, but the fact that his dad tells him that God has told me this is what I've got to do. That tells me that at least during the time Isaac has been growing up, Abraham has been teaching his son who God is. Because if Isaac didn't know, his response would have been, I don't know this God you're talking about. Whoever this is, I'm out of here. But Isaac clearly had enough faith of his own to know what God had done, and that his dad had a relationship with God. I think the important lesson for us there is why it is so important for parents to teach your kids about God from the very beginning. All right, verse 10 says, Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son, which tells more than likely he probably had the knife up here aiming for his heart. I can't imagine that he would have cut his throat. That would have been the hard way to go. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And by the way, which angel of the Lord do you think talked to him?
Jesus.
Now, verse 12 proves it, because it says, verse 12, and he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So this angel of the Lord, who speaks in the first person in verse 12, says, you've not withheld him from the Lord, from me. So yes, this is Jesus speaking to him from heaven. By the way, when I say Jesus, because you may say, well, how do we know this wasn't the Father? Because the Father is never, at any time in Scripture, referred to as the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord is, in every inference we have where we can positively identify who it is, it's referring to the pre-incarnate Jesus. So, Angel of the Lord, Jesus himself, calls to him and says, don't do it. Now, notice he said what he declares, says, for now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Well, why did God have to do that to begin with? Doesn't God already know everything?
He wanted to prove it to Abraham.
You
Well-
know, for Abraham.
Might have, to some extent, wanted Abraham himself to realize, you know, where his faith was. But I think there's an even bigger reason. And I think we're reading it right now. God obviously already knew where Abraham's faith was. And Abraham knew where Abraham's faith was.
God was giving Abraham a chance to prove it.
Not only that, but prove it to who?
Isaac.
Isaac.
Well, maybe. But how about proving it to us?
Well,
He
that's-
didn't have to prove it to God because God already knew Abraham's heart, didn't he?
But that's like the whole point of the Bible is to show us. So
That's just it. Is remember what's this whole story is point for point pointing to the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. So the whole reason behind Abraham doing this is not to prove anything to God. God already knows. He doesn't have to prove anything to Abraham, even though Abraham, I have no doubt, learned from it, because Abraham knew he trusted God. But it's setting up this whole story, this entire model for every generation from then forward to include us, to show us the model of what would happen about 2,500 years later. Because then, when we read about the crucifixion, I mean, we see this and realize, hey, this has happened before.
It puts the notion of the Father's willingness to sacrifice the Son in the minds of God's people. Thousands of years before he was going to do that for them.
Now, we as Christians have already accepted that. But also keep in mind who has not, but yet will.
And this is
The Jews themselves.
This is a submissive Messiah.
So, at some point, remember at the end of the tribulation period, when the Jews, we're told, will, as a nation, finally come to faith in Christ, they will, by that point, realize, you know what? Everything that this Jesus guy did modeled exactly this story in Abraham, and that will be one more point. I was about to say nail in the coffin, but nail on the cross, so to speak, that will prove to the Jews Jesus really is the Son of God. So this isn't given just to prove it to us. It will also prove it to God's people at the point yet in our future when, as a nation, the remnant of Israel will get on their knees and say, He is our Messiah.
It's amazing. I was just thinking how they just were totally all, they just didn't understand the submissive Messiah. I just, how messed up the Sadducees and Pharisees were. That's incredible. Because, they just didn't put the pieces together at all.
No, they cannot bring themselves today to believe that their God would be a suffering servant.
Yeah.
But again, that's all prophesied, and that's also one of the reasons why we're told that when they do accept Christ, it's going to be a remnant of about a third of them that will finally be on their knees saying, we believe. The other 2/3 will have already been gone by that point. All right. Let's see. We said we was going to get down to verse 14, so let's see.
You're almost there.
Almost there. You're going to lose this bet. All right. Verse 13 says, Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Now, you'll notice this ram just somehow appears out of nowhere. Why didn't Abraham notice this ram over there before? Was he there, or is this another one of those instances where he was there,
Came
but
to
God
Jesus.
just
Blinded his eyes.
blinded him to what was there? It says, sees a ram caught in a thicket by its horns, and Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. So right there, what we have is now not only a model of a substitutionary atonement, but the model for what became the sacrificial system under the law of Moses. That a ram is offered up in place of Christ, who will be offered up as the ultimate lamb later on down the line. So we see a model not only of what is called substitutionary atonement, in other words, Christ substituting himself for us, but also the sacrifice of the ram under the sacrificial system in place of what would be Jesus. Verse 14, last one. Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. Which, by the way, in King James, you'll see that referred to as Jehovah Jireh, or Yahweh Yireh, is the way it would be pronounced in Hebrew. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Now, in the mount of the Lord it'll be provided. And where was it provided 2,000 years after that? On the mount of the Lord. All right, questions this evening?
I have kind of a crazy question. Do the Jews not believe the New Testament?
Absolutely not.
So what do they think the New Testament is?
Nonsense.
Most of them don't even know that it was written by Jews.
I have got a copy of a Jewish Bible in here in my office. It has every book of the Bible that we would call the Old Testament, but that's it. As far as the Jews, there is no New Testament.
You're still waiting.
Most of them are surprised by the content of it when they're exposed to it. I've watched videos of Messianic Jews witnessing to Jews on the streets in Israel, and most of the Jews in Israel don't have any idea what's in the New Testament, that it's this Christian book, and they expected to find all this hatred of Jews in it. And they don't understand that it was written by Jews, that it's the continuation of their story. It's amazing how ignorant most of them are about it.
Most of them know what the rabbi tells them.
Yeah, exactly.
And even then, most of them are ignorant to a large extent of their own scripture. For example, the book of Daniel. They're actively encouraged not to read Daniel.
Or Isaiah 53.
Well,
Or they're told a whole
So
different
why do they
interpretation that
encourage you
Israel
to
is the
read it?
suffering servant.
yeah.
So is Daniel even in their Bible?
Oh yeah, it's there. They're just told to ignore it. They're told that you can't understand Daniel.
There
You know,
was
don't
one-
bother reading Daniel.
There was one book in the Old Testament that wasn't in there though, isn't there?
Not that I know of.
The Catholic Bible has
Yeah,
some
the six-
books in
the
it.
six-
Yeah, you may be confusing the Catholic Apocrypha.
Well,
Now,
there were some Jews back in Jesus' time. I think it was the Sadducees were the ones who, or no, it was the Samaritans. Only had the first 5 books. They didn't have all of the other
that's
books
what they
after
call the
that.
Samaritan Pentateuch.
Yeah. They didn't have all the later prophets.
Right. To give you an example of basically how the Jews view what you call the New Testament. For example, Mormons. We know Mormons think they're Christians, but their understanding of Jesus is not at all biblical. But the Mormons have what they call another testament of Jesus Christ, which they call the Book of Mormon. We know the Book of Mormon exists. We just choose to ignore it because we know that it's nonsense. Now, I don't want to compare the Book of Mormon with the New Testament as, saying the New Testament is nonsense, but that is how the Jews would look at the New Testament. In the same sense that we would look at the Book of Mormon and say, not wasting our time reading that because we know that it's made up. Joseph Smith literally cooked up the Book of Mormon out of the top of his hat. And when I say literally, I do mean literally.
Found it under a tree.
What's that?
He found it under a tree.
Well, not only that, but then when he was challenged to actually
Show it.
produce these stones, he said, "Oh, well, the angel came and took them, and now I see visions of it when I look in my hat." And he literally, history proves, he would sit and look at his hat and pretend to be seeing these visions of the Book of Mormon in his hat, and would, recite to them. So, I mean, literally, he cooked all this stuff up off the top of his head. That's the Book of Mormon. We know that. We look at it as absolute nonsense. Well, that's
False
how the
prophecy.
Jew, what's that?
False prophecy.
Yeah, that's how the Jews look at the New Testament.
They
They
think
know
the
it
New Testament is
exists,
false
but
prophecy.
they just think it's a total, nonsense, and wouldn't waste their time, looking at it once. Now, if you could convince a Jew to actually read it, then certainly the Holy Spirit would get a hold of them and probably, might actually convict
Well,
them.
it does with some of them, I guess, because we have some Messianic Jews.
Oh, of course.
In our old church, yeah.
But that's it. Generally, their view of the New Testament is not unlike what we would consider something like that. Yeah, they know it exists. They just think it's nonsense.
In a little different vein, archaeologists have found what they believe was the remains or underneath Solomon's temple. It's under the southern part of Temple Mount. It's
Mhm.
there. And they found stuff there.
Oh yeah, they've been finding little bits and pieces of the foundation of that for years, but there's nothing left of the temple in the sense that the temple itself has been just totally destroyed.
They
But
said
yeah, they
where
find
they-
remnants of it here and there.
I think it was where they sacrificed the animals and the water is there. It's by City of David.
Mm,
But do you think they'd reuse that?
wouldn't have any way of knowing. I do know the Jews already have most of the implements required for the sacrificial system recast and in storage for at such point in the future as they're able to rebuild a temple. If they could rebuild the temple, they would be prepared to sanctify the temple and begin the sacrificial system immediately. The only thing that's stopping them right now is